19.2 Monopsony in the Labor Market. This chapter covers meaning of monopsony and how wages are determined in monopsony market, a union and a monopsony, monopsony and the minimum wage, practice problem. Monopsony. So far, we assume that the labor market was competitive. That is, we assume that there were many buyers and sellers of labor, so each buyer or seller had a negligible effect on the wage. Imagine the labor market in a small town dominated by a single large employer. That employer can exert large influence on the going wage, and it may well use that market power to alter the outcome. Such a market in which there is a single buyer is called a monopsony. A monopsony labor market has one employer. In some part of the country, managed healthcare organization or the major employer of healthcare professionals. In some communities, Walmart, the main employer of sales clerks. These firms have monopsony power. A monopsony, a market with one buyer, acts on the buying side of a market on a similar way to a monopoly, a market with one seller on the selling side. A monopoly firm produces less of the good than would a competitive firm. By reducing the quantity offered for sale, the monopoly firm moves along the product's demand curve, raising the price and also its profits. Similarly, a monopsony firm in a labor market hires fewer workers than would a competitive firm. By reducing the number of jobs available, the monopsony firm moves along the labor supply curve, reducing the wage it pays and raising its profits. Thus, both monopolist and the monopsonist reduce economic activity in a market below the socially optimal level. So, in both cases, the existence of market power distorts the outcome and causes deadweight losses. Figure illustrates a monopsony labor market. Like all firms, a monopsony faces a downward sloping value of marginal product curve VMP, which is its demand for labor curve D. The curve labeled VMP is equal to D in the figure. What is special about monopsony is the marginal cost of labor. For a firm in a competitive labor market, the marginal cost of labor is the wage rate. For a monopsony, the marginal cost of labor exceeds the wage rate. The reason is that being the only buyer in the market, the firm faces the upward sloping supply of labor S in the figure. To attract one more worker, the monopsony must offer a higher wage rate, but it must pay this higher wage rate to all its workers. So the marginal cost of a worker is the wage rate plus the increased wage bill that arises from paying all the workers the higher wage rate. To find the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire, the monopsony sets the marginal cost of labor equal to the value of marginal product of labor. In figure, this outcome occurs when the firm employs 100 workers. To hire 100 workers, the firm must pay $10 an hour on the supply of labor curve. To each worker is paid $10 an hour, but the value of marginal product of labor is $20 an hour. So the firm makes an economic profit of $10 an hour on the marginal worker. If the labor market in figure were competitive, the equilibrium wage rate and employment would be determined by the demand and supply curves. The wage rate would be $15 an hour and 150 workers would be employed. So compared with a competitive labor market, a monopsony pays a lower wage rate and employs fewer workers. A union and a monopsony. A union is like a monopoly. If the union, monopoly seller, faces a monopsony buyer, the situation is called bilateral monopoly. An example of bilateral monopoly is the Writers Guild of America that represents film, television, and radio writers, and an employers' alliances that represent CBS, MGM, NBC, and other entertainment companies. Every 3 years, the Writers Guild and the Employers' Alliance negotiate a pay deal. In bilateral monopoly, the outcome is determined by bargaining, which depends on the cost that each party can inflict on each other. The firm can shut down temporarily and lock down its workers, and the workers can shut down the firm by striking. Each party estimates the other's strength and what it will lose if it does not agree to the other's demand. Usually, an agreement is reached without a strike or a lockdown. The threat is usually enough to bring the bargaining parties to an agreement. When a strike or lockdown does occur, it is because one party has misjudged the cost each party can inflict on the other. Such an event occurred in November 2007 when the writers and entertainment producers failed to agree on a compensation deal. A 100-day strike followed that ended up costing the entertainment industry an estimated $2 billion. In a monopsony, a union can bargain for a higher wage rate without sacrificing jobs. A similar outcome can arise in a monopsony labor market when a minimum wage law is enforced. Let's look at the effect of minimum wage. Monopsony and the minimum wage. In a competitive labor market, a minimum wage that exceeds the equilibrium wage decreases employment. In a monopsony labor market, a minimum wage can increase both the wage rate and employment. Let's see how. Figure shows a monopsony labor market without a union. The wage rate is $10 an hour and the 100 workers are employed. A minimum wage law is passed that requires employers to pay at least $15 an hour. The monopsony now faces a perfectly elastic supply of labor at $15 an hour up to 150 workers along the minimum wage line. To hire more than 150 workers, a wage rate above $15 an hour must be paid along the supply curve. Because the wage rate is $15 an hour up to 150 workers, so is the marginal cost of labor $15 an hour up to 150 workers. To maximize profit, the monopsony sets the marginal cost of labor equal to the value of marginal product of labor on the demand curve. That is, the monopsony hires 150 workers and pays $15 an hour. To the minimum wage law has raising the wage rate and increasing the number of workers employed. Practice problem. What determines the amount of labor that households plan to supply? The quantity of labor supplied depends on the wage rate. A rise in the wage rate increases the quantity supplied. Beyond a higher enough wage rate, rise in the wage rate decreases the quantity supplied. The supply curve eventually bends backward. How is the wage rate and employment determined in a competitive labor market? Demand and supply determine the wage rate in a competitive labor market. How do labor unions influence the wage rates? A labor union can raise wage rate by restricting the supply or increasing the demand for labor. What is a monopsony and what is a monopsony able to pay, and why a monopsony able to pay a lower wage rate than a firm in a competitive labor market? A market with a single buyer is a monopsony. A monopsony can lower the wage rate below the competitive level because just like monopoly, monopsony has control over the market since it is the only buyer of labor. How is the wage rate determined when the union faces a monopsony? A wage rate determined through bargaining when a union faces a monopsony, which depends on the cost that each party can inflict on other. Usually an agreement is reached without a strike. What is the effect of a minimum wage law in a monopsony union or a minimum wage in a monopsony labor market can raise the wage rate without a fall in employment?